Hi there. Thanks for joining us. This is Space Nuts. My name is Andrew Dunkley. Coming up on this episode, we're going to be looking at a photograph. Yeah, it's finally time for us to share our family photos with you. No, it's not. James Webb Space Telescope has taken a photo of an exoplanet. It's not the first time it's taken a direct photo of an exoplanet, but this one is very old and very cold, and we'll tell you why. They've spotted spots on Mars, and the spots that they have spotted could mean we've spotted life as it was, possibly. We'll put a spot on that and talk about it later. And a Danish astronomer that dates back about 400 years or so, Tycho Brahe, is in the news. We'll tell you why on this edition of Space Nuts.
15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 10, 9. Ignition sequence start.
Space Nuts.
5, 4, 3, 2.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Space Nuts.
Astronauts report it feels good.
And the man who's always spot on with his astronomy and space science is Professor Fred Watson, an astronomer at large. Hello, Fred.
Very nice segue there, Andrew. Thank you for that.
Couldn't help it. Couldn't help it.
No,
Gee, it's cold. It's cold here. Oh, we have been hit with a real plunge in the temperatures. Last week, we had a couple of days where it got 7 to 18, 7 to 19 degrees, which in the middle of July is beautiful. But it came back with a vengeance the other day. We've been plunging to minuses in the early morning and barely reaching double figures during the day. And it's sunny. That's the weird part. It is really cold and sunny. And that's not a combination that's very, very common around here. If it's cold, it's usually bleakish as well. But the days are beautiful, but the air is freezing. And I'm told, I believe it's because of an effect that's happened in Antarctica, where the troposphere rose 50 degrees in just a couple of days. And that causes a really big impact on the cold air in Antarctica and just pushes it north. And that's what's causing it, I believe.
There you go. I certainly knew it was blast of Antarctic air that you were getting, which is cold and dry, which I guess is why you've got clear skies as well. Yeah.
It's lovely, but you go outside and your fingers start to, and you think, what's going on? Isn't it supposed to be warm? No.
Well,
not really.
With apologies to our Canadian listeners who undergo far worse than this every year.
Oh, yes, indeed. Although they've been dealing with forest fires.
The opposite. Yeah,
lately,
in fact, Jasper, we were in Jasper earlier this year.
We were there last year, and while we were there, we were getting fire warnings on our phones. And
that's interesting.
Here we are a year later, and it's happening all over again. It's just become part of the landscape in most countries these days, unfortunately. Everything good with you, Fred?
It's acceptable, yes, thank you.
Acceptable.
Things are going well. No, I guess the correct word, Andrew, is nominal. Everything's nominal.
Yeah, that's a great word. All right. Now, let us get into a few stories. But before we get into the main crux of it, you've got some news on SpaceX. We were talking about the Falcon rockets a couple of weeks ago and some issues there. Things have changed.
Yes, they have. So Falcon 9s were grounded after the failure of the second stage of one of them. We did talk about it, and it resulted in an attempt to rescue some of the satellites that were. It was a 22 or 23 Starlink satellites that were supposed to be being orbited, but they didn't make it. And I think even though they made contact with some of the satellites, they didn't get them into stable orbit. So SpaceX has investigated. The problem was a liquid oxygen leak around to do with insulation around that upper stage engine. There's a quote from SpaceX, which is the cause of the leak was identified as a crack in a sense line for a pressure sensor attached to the vehicle's oxygen system. The line cracked due to fatigue caused by high loading from engine vibration and looseness in the clamp that normally constrains the line. Despite the leak, the second stage continued to operate throughout the duration of the first burn, completed its engine shutdown, where it entered the coast phase of the mission intended for the parking orbit. The second burn of the upper stage was planned to circularize the orbit ahead of the satellite deployment, but that didn't work, basically, to cut a long story short. But that's all been accepted by the FAA. I think that's the organisation that actually has to ratify their capability to launch, and they've taken remedial steps. I think they've actually got rid of that particular pressure sensor, which has solved the problem, and so they now have the go-ahead to launch. And in fact, they've already carried out, I think, more than one launch. I think they've done 3 this week.
Very good.
Cape Canaveral and Vandenberg. Yeah.
I think I read something the other day that said that rocket launches are becoming so common. I think there's almost one a day in the world.
It's certainly getting on that way. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, when you go back to the 50s and 60s, they were a rare thing, but now they've just become so very common. In fact, a lot of them don't even make the news because it's just that common thing.
That's right. Yes.
Now, before we continue, just want to say hello to a few of our live viewers, one of which is Misty. Misty is an administrator on the Space Nuts podcast group Facebook page, so it gives me a chance to publicly say thank you for all the work she does for us behind the scenes, keeping people in line on Facebook. That's a big job. And hello to Danny, and regular questioner on our live feeds is Board Broke Build. So hello to all of you. Now, Fred, the James Webb Space Telescope's in the news again. That's very rare as well.
It's doing a fabulous job, I have to say.
Yes, it has. And it's been able to take direct photographs of exoplanets. Prior to that, we got artists' renditions of what an exoplanet might look like, and they're fantastic. But these are direct photos, although they tend to be a bit fuzzy. But this latest photograph of an exoplanet is a little bit different from others because it's possibly the oldest one they've ever found, and it's a darn cold place.
That's right. So this is basically a star whose name is Epsilon Indi A. It's in the constellation of Indus, Southern Hemisphere constellation. It's about 12 light years away, but it has a planet, which has been suspected because of other observations. I'm not sure what they were, whether they were, I think they were radial velocity observations. That means the Doppler wobble technique, where you actually analyze the velocity of the parent star, and since that's sort of varying periodically, you can tell that there's a planet pulling it out of place, and was certainly the initial way in which most exoplanets were found, and then it went over to the transit method, where you look at the dimming of a star as a planet moves in front of it. So this planet its existence was suspected. But it's turned out exactly as you've said, with the fact that we now have an image of this planet, which is called Epsilon Indi AB, because the B stands for the planet. And it's actually, I think it's puzzled the scientists. And in fact, the scientists who are working on this are at the Max Planck Institute for Astronomy in Heidelberg. I have colleagues who work there, but I don't know this particular one, Elizabeth Matthews, who's the lead author of this paper. And Elizabeth says, while we expected to image a planet in this system with the Webb telescope, because there were radial velocity indications of its presence, that's the Doppler wobble technique, the planet we found isn't what we had predicted. It's about twice as massive, a little further from its star, and has a different orbit from what we expected. The cause of this discrepancy remains an open question. And that's actually a really important thing, because if we've got it wrong when it comes to interpreting these radial velocity measurements of stars, then we need to know that, because there's a lot of work being done about things like hot Jupiters and all the rest of it, things we've talked about before. So what is this planet? It's several times the mass of Jupiter. It's, in an elliptical orbit, one that's not circular. Excuse me, but it's fainter than expected at shorter infrared wavelengths. And that suggests, first of all, that it's probably got a cloudy atmosphere, but there may be carbon-based molecules in the atmosphere. Methane, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide are being suggested. But the cool bit of this, and it really is cool, is its temperature. The average temperature of this planet, 2 degrees Celsius.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a Jupiter, or more than Jupiter mass planet. Jupiter is a gas giant in our own solar system, which is at about minus 90, something like that, minus 95 or thereabouts degrees Celsius. It's way out in the solar system, so it's very cold. So this one is relatively warm compared with our gas giants, but it is much cooler than any other exoplanet that has been observed directly. And there's about 25 of them that we've seen directly. And the problem, by the way, in imaging a planet directly is that you're blinded by the light of the star that it's going around, because the star's right next door to it, and it's up to 1 billion times brighter. So you've got to take away the light of the star. That's done by means of an instrument called a coronagraph. And if you can do that cleverly enough, you can leave an image of the planet itself nestling in the sort of outer light of the star. That's what's happened here. So the issue is, as I said, it's colder than any other exoplanet. That makes it harder to observe, because an exoplanet that's warm emits more energy. Now, this star is actually because its name implies, because it's got an A after it, Epsilon Indi A. It's the main star in a system of 3 other stars, so it's a triplet system. It is a red dwarf star, and that doesn't surprise us, because red dwarfs are the easiest ones to observe when it comes to subtracting the light of the star, because they're relatively faint, smaller and cooler than the sun. And the point about this star is that it's elderly. It's probably the same age as the sun, about 1.5 billion years. And most of the exoplanets that have been observed directly have been around much younger stars. So they're much younger in their life history. So this one's really interesting from that point of view. It's a mature planet, probably been around for 4 or 5 billion years. It's going around a cool red dwarf star, and is in an unexpected orbit. So there's a few little mysteries to solve there. And just a footnote that you might know more about than me, Andrew.
I know. I think I know where you're going.
Yeah, it features, I think, this star and fictional planets around the star featured on a number of science fiction movies and games like Halo.
Yeah, Halo, which I played when it first came out with my boys. We loved Halo.
Yeah,
that's a franchise that's still going too. They keep releasing new versions of the game. It even made it into a TV series, which lasted, I think, 2 seasons. But it's featured in Halo. It's featured in books, and it was a pretty popular place in Star Trek episodes. So Epsilon Indi is well known to the science fiction community.
Yeah, yeah. There you go.
Yeah, yeah. But what's interesting is I don't think ultimately this will be the oldest and coldest planet we ever find, but it is at the moment. And the gas giants in our solar system are colder. What does that mean in terms of how gas giants age, or is it just to do with proximity to the star?
Maybe, yes. I mean, we think that gas giants get big because they are cold. And, in the solar system, the gas giants are all beyond the frost line. So that means that water vapor, the commonest 2-element molecule in the universe, could freeze out. And so probably what you've got is a rocky core with a very heavy, a massive, pretty dense layer of ice around it. But it may be that this planet, like the one we were talking about in the last one episode of Space Nuts, has migrated into a closer orbit, and that might push its temperature up.
Ah, okay. Well, yeah, I suppose that's something they'll be able to analyse if they can collect the data. It's such a, I mean, it's not a long way away from us, but it's still a long way, you know.
That's right. It is. So it's a very nice piece of work, and the team, I think, are expecting to observe other relatively nearby planets to look for even colder ones. As you said, I don't suppose it'll hold the record for long.
No, probably not. You can read that story on nasaspaceflight.com if you want to know more about it. While we're talking about Jupiter, though, Fred, I read a story just in the last few days about the storm, the red spot, and how it's getting smaller. And when you look back through recent history, it has really shrunk a lot, although it's still big enough for Earth to fit inside, barely though. But they think they know why it's getting smaller. It's running out of stuff to eat. Apparently, they think it fed on smaller storms, but those storms are diminishing as well. So the red spot doesn't have any sustenance and therefore is losing weight, basically.
Interesting. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. This is Space Nuts. Andrew Dunkley here with Professor Fred Watson. Let's take a little break from the show to tell you about our sponsor, Incogni. Now, if you use the internet, chances are you've registered your name, your address, your phone number, your credit card details on one or more or many websites. Occasionally, those websites will get infiltrated and that data gets sold on the dark web. And there was a case recently where 13 million people most likely had their medical data sold through the dark web. 13 million. Now, what happens to that data? Well, it could be just about anything. Data is a valuable commodity these days. It's used to create fake IDs. It's used to enable people to make spam phone calls and spam emails. It can lead to you being scammed. There was a famous case only recently where somebody got a call from their bank and it was so convincing they gave them information which led to them losing tens of thousands of dollars. And the bank won't pay up because they voluntarily gave the information out. It's a very nasty case. But this is what happens. So what do you do about it? Well, you can go in and clean it up yourself, but as fast as you do it, some other organisation or individual has already taken your data and sold it again. It's estimated it would take you probably 2 years to wipe the internet of all your personal information if you went it alone, if you knew how to. So probably better to get someone to do it for you. The solution is simple. You sign up to Incogni and they will do all the hard work for you. They'll clear all your personal data from the World Wide Web. And they'll keep cleaning it up in an ongoing fashion. All you have to do is sign up, fill out a bit of background information, give them permission to work on your behalf, and then you just go from there. And it's simple, it's inexpensive, and it gives you peace of mind knowing that your personal information cannot be corrupted or stolen or sold on the web. Through Incogni. So how do you do this? Well, as a Space Nuts listener, you get a special deal. Just go to incogni.com/spacenuts. That's incogni.com/spacenuts. There is a special deal on at the moment, 60% discount, and that will enable Incogni on your behalf to limit public access to your private info, and reduce that risk of identity theft significantly and keep your data from being sold. And that's what it's all about. There are several options in terms of subscriptions as an individual, or you can do it as a family and friends plan. Each plan varies in price, but if you pay for an annual plan up front, it really drops the price significantly over the course of a year. But if you want to pay month by month, you can do that too. And don't forget, it comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. A 30-day money-back guarantee. All you have to do is log in, create an account, and sign up for whatever deal suits you at incogni.com/spacenuts. And don't forget, the coupon word Space Nuts, surprisingly. So that's incogni.com/spacenuts and the coupon code Space Nuts. Now, back to the show.
0G, and I feel fine.
Space Nuts.
Now, to a rocky planet that we only rarely talk about named Mars. This is a really fascinating story, and it, again, like we discussed last week, involves a rover making a discovery. Last week it was finding sulfur. This week it's finding these what they've described as leopard spots on rocks on the planet's surface. This is the Perseverance Rover. What's really interesting about this story is these spots may mean something rather significant.
That's right. So it's a rock that is about probably 90 by 60 centimeters, 3 feet by 2 feet in the old measure. And it's got a name. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Chiava Falls. It's named after, I believe, a feature in the Grand Canyon. I think that's right. So that rock has all sorts of interesting aspects to it, which is puzzling scientists as to how these various features can exist in one rock, because they seem to be, some of it suggests that there's a lot of hot water been involved with this, too hot for anything to live in. And yet we've got these, what have been called leopard spots, tiny little white spots, which I think have a black ring around them. And they are on Earth, the sort of thing that you find when you've got fossilized microbes. They're similar to what we find in rocks where you've got fossilized microbial activity on Earth. So this is why people are very excited about this rock. Is it the first evidence of there having been living organisms on Mars, or is it purely chemical? And apparently the mission scientists who are working on this have kind of analysed this thing to death. They've used every piece of technology that they've got on the spacecraft. They've zapped it with a laser. They've kind of looked at it with the spectrometers. They've looked at it with their mass spectrometers. They've really done everything to analyse it. And they still don't really have an answer as to whether this is the result of life or not. The only way we'll get that answer is by bringing it back. And there are missions being planned to bring rocks back to Earth from Mars so we can analyze them with laboratory instruments on Mars. But this is not likely to happen. Well, they're talking about 2040 now.
Yeah.
That return mission has been pushed back, and I'm not even sure whether the return mission that was being planned actually included rocks as big as this one. I think it was more for the caches of soil that have been collected on Mars and left in little piles on the surface of the planet.
Yeah. It's very disappointing to hear that, because we all want to know. We all so very much want to know, and we're finding telltale signs that life may have existed on Mars when it was a hotter, wetter place. And how long that life, if it did exist, survived is another big question. But pushing it back to 2040, I mean, that's a gut punch, really, isn't it?
It is. My understanding is that NASA's concerned about how much it costs to do that. And
but isn't it the biggest question?
Well,
in all of existence, is whether or not there's
life elsewhere.
Been life beyond. I mean, isn't it worth spending a couple of bucks to find out?
Yeah, I think it's 11.5 billion is the current estimate.
Chump change.
Yeah,
or should I say Trump change? No, it's not a lot. It really isn't.
What I was going to say is that, as I understand it, NASA is trying to interest the private sector into doing this. Yeah. So if you can get a company that's prepared to invest a lot of money in a mission like this, that could be, certainly would put that company on the map, wouldn't it? think
There's
SpaceX
probably,
or something like that.
well, there's probably a couple of companies that could already do it,
Yes.
and it wouldn't make much of a dent in their value. So maybe they should be negotiating.
I think that might be what's happening. Maybe we'll hear something. All this sort of thing goes on behind the scenes as always.
Yeah.
But maybe
I mean,
we'll hear
if
something
Elon
eventually.
Musk is planning to colonize Mars, problem solved.
Yeah, well, he needs to know. He needs to know if there's stuff that's already colonized it, and that might be the answer to that.
Yeah, could be. No, that it is a really fascinating story, and well worth reading the whole thing. But we've been toying with the idea of life on Mars since I don't know, the year dot.
Yes,
And the more we look, the more the evidence stacks up that it probably did exist. We just can't sort of nail that thing down.
yeah, that's right.
But time will tell. And of course, it's not the only target in the solar system.
No, that's right.
The ice moons are certainly areas of interest as well. Let's move on to our final story, Fred, and this dates back a couple of years when you were just a young fella, and it involves a Danish astronomer named Tycho Brahe. He's in the news, but when you consider how long ago he was doing what he was doing, this is a bit of a surprise.
Well, yes, he's one of the great names in astronomy. He just very briefly, he grew up in the Danish nobility. In fact, it's a really interesting story. I have one of my books had a whole chapter on Tycho, and I've been to where he lived and worked many times.
Oh, wow.
So it's been very much part of my my own astronomical journey. But he was stolen from his parents by an uncle and brought up by them, and apparently that was quite common back in the day. But he was a Danish nobleman, all set for a career in diplomacy and things like that, but he discovered astronomy, partly because of a supernova, Tycho's supernova in 1576, I think it was. Got mad keen on astronomy, started building instruments. The king at the time, King Frederick II, I think it was, good King Fred, he gave him this island in the Øresund, which is the strait between modern-day Sweden and Denmark, not very far from Copenhagen. And the island is called Vane. It's now VEN. It was HVEN in those days because it's part of Sweden now rather than Denmark. But anyway, he built this castle there called Uraniborg, which was fitted with all kinds of astronomical equipment. He basically, in the 1580s, decided that wasn't good enough. He recognized that this castle with his astronomical instruments was full of vibrations, so that limited how much he could measure things. So he built an underground observatory called Stjerneborg, underground in the sense that there were crypts which were dug into the soil of Vane, and he put his instruments there and had a covering on them to protect the weather, but they were completely open. And these weren't telescopes. This was just before the invention of the telescope. So they're all naked eye observations. But he managed to make measurements accurate to about 20 seconds of arc, which were what allowed Johannes Kepler, who was one of his students, to formulate the laws of planetary motion. That's Tycho Brahe's life in a nutshell.
Yeah, amazing.
But the point is that he also, as many scientists did in those days, tinkered with alchemy. The idea of the elixir of life, or I've forgotten what it was called, the philosopher's stone. That was it. That was the philosopher's stone, the thing that will give you eternal life, plus turning things into gold. All of that, he tinkered around with that, and unfortunately, Tycho's castle was destroyed after his death. In fact, it may even have been before his death, because he left the island of Vane when Frederick's son Christian took over, and Christian didn't like Tycho, so booted him off the island. Anyway, the last few years of Tycho's life were not very pleasant. But the locals essentially demolished the castle because he'd been a bit of a tyrant governing the island, and they took all the stones from the castle to build their own houses, which is kind of what you do if the boss leaves. And so it's only remnants that are found of the castle. But some shards of material, including glass and ceramics, which probably came from Tycho's equipment, they were excavated back in the late 1980s. And they've been saved, but they've now been analysed in detail by scientists at the University of Southern Denmark, who've produced some very interesting results. And this is using 21st century analytical techniques, laser ablation and all sorts of things like this, to discover what was in these samples of the containers that Tycho used. And it turned out there was nickel, copper, zinc, tin, antimony, tungsten, gold, mercury, and lead on the shards. And these are ones that are very much mainstays of an alchemist's laboratory. And I'm quoting the Cosmos magazine here. It's a lovely way to put it. And they are, too. The interesting one that has produced a bit of a puzzle is tungsten. That's right. Yeah. Tungsten wasn't really known at that time, and yet it's found in Tycho's laboratory. And this is, what a interesting suggestion. Maybe he was more ahead of his time than we thought he was.
Possibly so. Yeah, fascinating. And so they've only just kind of happened across this now. Now that they've done the analysis.
That's right.
Makes you wonder what he was up to.
Yeah, that's right. He was a one-person scientific institution, and he brought scientists from all over Europe to work with him. They were, his laboratory assistants and his colleagues. He was very much into the modern way of doing science because he realized he had to publish everything. He ran out of paper for his publication, so he built a paper mill and made paper on the island. It's totally entrepreneurial and an extraordinary person. Maybe he was even more extraordinary than we knew before from this recent work.
Yeah, it's a pity it sort of came to a grinding halt the way it did by the sound of things, but he did have a legacy because his students went on to bigger and better things, and that's probably one of his great achievements, that he inspired others to do wonderful work.
Most notably Kepler with his laws of planetary motion, but he was also into what we now call prosthetic surgery. He lost most of his nose in a sword fight when he was 19, and he tinkered around with copper and brass to make a false nose. Apparently, he had a silver and gold one on Sundays. So it's and he was in contact with people who were doing the same sort of thing. Quite amazing.
Incredible bloke, yeah. They should make a movie about him, but
actually they should, and they may well have done in Denmark. And just to clarify, his name was actually Tycho Brahe. That's how it would have been pronounced, but it's Latinized to Tycho Brahe. We pronounce it now.
And some people would pronounce his first name Tycho, and it reminds me of the TV series The Expanse, which had a space station in it named Tycho Station.
Yeah, that's where it came from.
Yep. Yeah, I always wondered. I didn't look it up, but now I know.
Yeah.
That is really, really great story. And if you would like to read it, as Fred mentioned, it's in cosmosmagazine.com. One more thing before we finish up, Fred. Those who listen to our podcast could be using any number of platforms, but one of the platforms that's fallen by the wayside is Google Podcasts. And we did have quite a few people that used Google. Google has basically asked all the people who used Google Podcast, you probably got an email about it, maybe even this week, I got one today, saying if you subscribed to podcasts on Google and you can no longer access them, you can still transfer them to YouTube. So if you haven't done that yet, You can transfer all your podcasts, including Space Nuts, from Google Podcasts to the YouTube platform, where I will always remind you to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. So just wanted to let you know about that. Fred, we're done for another day. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure. As always good to talk about these things. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Not a problem. We'll catch you again soon. Professor Fred Watson, astronomer at large, and don't forget Hugh in the studio. There you go. I remembered. And from me, Andrew Dunkley, thanks for your company. Catch you on the very next episode of Space Nuts. See you then. Bye-bye.
Space Nuts. You've been listening to the Space Nuts podcast.
Mission complete, Houston.
Available at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or your favorite podcast player. You can also stream on demand at Bytes.com.
This has been another quality podcast production from Bytes.com.